Welcome to all of you who are joining us from around the country tonight. This is Denver, Colorado, and we welcome you to WorldDenver and a very important program tonight, Understanding the Crisis of Religion and Politics in Muslim Societies. We're happy to have all of our sister organizations, and special greetings to WorldDenver's Executive Director, Karen DeBartolome, who is putting her feet up on a stool in Salt Lake City. We miss you. We hope that we do well for you tonight. Before we begin the dialogue, we have a very special recognition that we wanted to share with you. So I would like to introduce Matt Larson, Secretary of the Board of Directors of WorldDenver, with a very important recognition.
So we're here briefly to recognize some folks here from the city of Fort Morgan as our volunteers of the month. The city of Fort Morgan has had significant involvement with WorldDenver and WorldDenver programming, and just recently has had involvement in programs involving at-risk youth, journalists, and also U.S. foreign policy challenges. And the reason that the Fort Morgan folks are here tonight is really because they're an example of the citizen diplomacy that WorldDenver seeks to promote. And they're really an example of the value of international exchange. And one of the main things that they've been up to lately, and that's particularly relevant to what we're talking about tonight, is the immigrant integration efforts that they've been conducting out on the eastern plains of Colorado. So just recently, the city has had an influx and significant amount of Muslim immigrants coming into the city. And they've used dialogues, workshops, and community celebrations to bridge the receiving and immigrant communities and bring them together. This has involved work in the media, work in politics, and really just getting local leaders on board in order to facilitate a dialogue and facilitate a transition and welcome these people into their community. So for that reason, we're here to honor you guys as the volunteers of the month. What I'll do is I'll give a brief background on each one of you, and then we can pass out your certificates. I only have two hands here, so we're a little short. First, the people that can't be with us tonight are Dan Barker of the Fort Morgan Times and John Laporte, also of the Fort Morgan Times. Both of them wrote compelling stories about immigrants moving in and out of the community. We have Chief Keith Kredich of the Fort Morgan Police Department. He has over 27 years of experience in law enforcement, and he worked in the integration efforts and also recently gave a talk to one of the international delegations about the best practices from a law enforcement standpoint in integrating these folks into their community and making them a part of the community. We have Mayor Terry McAllister. He just began his second term of mayor and previously served on the city council since 2003 in Fort Morgan. He has worked very hard to facilitate the integration efforts, and we're pleased to be able to honor him tonight. We have Jeffrey Wells, who is the city manager. Jeff is very active in the community and serves in various capacities for charitable and youth groups. And he's also a pretty good example of a citizen diplomat because he speaks both Italian, English, and Spanish. So, and then finally, we have Brenda Zion of One Morgan County. Brenda is a fourth-generation Morgan County resident. She has been with One Morgan County since 2008. And as a lot of us in this room can appreciate, she led the transition of One Morgan County to being an independent nonprofit, which is something that we've done here lately with WorldDenver. Her leadership and integration has been previously recognized, and she's been awarded with Group Publishing's Community Service Award, the Fort Morgan Police Department Citizen Citation for Meritorious Service, and the Fort Morgan Area Chamber of Commerce 2011 Citizen of the Year. So with that, we have Mayor McAllister. Here's your. Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Wells. Thank you. Chief Kredich. Thank you. And Brenda Zion.
Thank you.
and I'll give these other two for you to bring back to Fort Morgan. So thank you very much for your efforts. These are our volunteers of the month.
Wow, that's some pretty spectacular accomplishments in Fort Morgan, and we are so very grateful to you, and thank you again for all you do. Before we go further, I should tell you who I am. Your MC tonight, Kay Landon, I am the program chair for WorldDenver. And I also want to be sure that you know that this program tonight is a World Affairs Councils of America program that is brought to you with support provided by a grant from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. So we are very appreciative of that support. And our audiovisual crew tonight is from Wave Audiovisual, and we thank them for their support this evening. So now to the dialogue. I'm going to introduce both of our participants to you now, and then they will join each other in the soft, comfy chairs on the stage. First, Ambassador Marianne Casey. Ambassador Casey is a Middle East specialist who developed deep area expertise in Arab North Africa while working for 12 years in the region as a diplomat. She was selected by President Bush Sr. to be his ambassador to Algeria, and later President Clinton tapped her to serve as ambassador to Tunisia. She spent more than a decade in Washington, D.C. at the State Department, where she was director for North Africa. Later, in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, she managed a team of 100 professionals engaged in global research and analysis for the Secretary of State. She has been a diplomat in residence at the University of Colorado at Boulder, where she taught a course on the art and practice of diplomacy. I'd like to take that. It would help me in my next life when I intend to be a diplomat of some sort. I won't be very good. After her retirement from the State Department, she lectured periodically at the Joint Forces Staff College in Norfolk, Virginia. She's a Colorado native, a graduate of the University of Colorado, and speaks fluent French, Arabic, and German. Dr. Nader Hashemi, I think I'm saying that right, is Assistant Professor of Middle East and Islamic Politics at the Joseph Corbell School of International Relations at the University of Denver. He is also the new director of the Center for Middle East Studies at DU. His doctorate is from the University of Toronto in political science. He was an Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow at Northwestern University and a visiting assistant professor at the UCLA Global Institute. His research interests lie at the intersection of comparative politics and political theory, in particular debates on religion and democracy, secularism and its discontents. He is the author of Islam, Secularism, and Liberal Democracy Toward a Democratic Theory for Muslim Societies, and he is the co-editor of The People Reloaded, The Green Movement and the Struggle for Iran's Future. Welcome to both of our guests tonight.
Dr. Hashemi.
How are you?
I'm great, and it's a pleasure to be here with you, and we're looking forward, I think, to all of us to what you have to say, because it's a very contemporary topic, and one I think that all Americans, not just those in government or involved in planning, have focused on in one way or another, certainly over the last 10 years. So if I could ask you to share some of your thoughts with us.
Well, sure. This event is titled Understanding the Crisis of Religion and Politics in Muslim Societies. And I'm reminded of a very famous aphorism or saying that I heard quite frequently, when I was growing up in southern Ontario. I'm from Canada, near the city of Toronto. And I remember distinctly hearing many times in popular culture, in school, in the media, that the two subjects that you should steadfastly avoid in the after-dinner hour, among polite company, are the topics of religion and politics. And I remember, recoiling because, those are the two topics that I was interested in growing up. I came from an immigrant family. We talked about religion and politics around the dinner table on a regular basis, and those are the two topics that you were supposed to avoid. And it really wasn't until I moved to the Middle East, had a chance to live there, that I really understood the wisdom of those remarks. But nevertheless, that's what I chose to sort of focus my area of research, my study on. And I think many Americans, as was indicated, are quite baffled as they observe, the politics of the region, particularly the Arab Spring. There was a lot of enthusiasm about the possibility of quick democratic transitions taking place, and I think people sort of watching the news today in Egypt, in Libya, in Yemen, Bahrain, etc., are a bit sort of perplexed as to why the example of democratic transitions that we saw in Eastern Europe, for example, in 1989 after the fall of the Berlin Wall, have not manifested themselves in the context of the contemporary Middle East. Why is there still turmoil? And really, I think one of the big questions that baffles a lot of people are why the persistence and the popularity of religious-based political parties, fundamentalist movements that in the recent elections in Tunisia and in Egypt have done quite well. And I think that's a baffling sort of question, a set of events. And I think one of the reasons why it's baffling is I think many people approach the study of the Middle East from the perspective of their own historical experience. And I'm referring here to a American-centric, Western-centric experience. And there's often an assumption, and I would say a misguided assumption, to somehow assume that American history or Western history is really universal history. That because we have gone through a long series of political contestation, debates, transformations, development, learning over the role that religion should play in society. We've developed over a long period of time, after acrimonious debate, a broad consensus over the need to separate church and state, that because that has been our experience in the West, that somehow there is an assumption that has been the experience of the rest of the planet. And it's not. And I think one of the problems here is, and one of the points that I encourage my students to do, is when you are thinking about, when you're trying to understand another part of the world, you have to try and understand that part of the world on their own terms, through the prism of their historical experience, which has in many ways been qualitatively different, particularly with respect to the role that religion has played in politics. And there's a lot that I could say on the topic, but with respect to the question of fundamentalism and why it's so prominent and why it's still playing a very important role in the politics of these societies, one has to be cognizant of the fact that in many developing societies where tradition and a very sort of simple way of life has been the norm for many hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, the transition from a traditional society to a modern society is inherently a disruptive process. It is inherently chaotic. It is inherently complicated and very troubling for members of that society. And what you see throughout the course of history in societies that are undergoing rapid social and political change, upheaval, transformation in a short period of time, what you often see is the revival of a certain religious consciousness in these societies as a security blanket, as a way of somehow navigating the troubled waters of the modern age. And in the case of the modern Middle East or Muslim majority societies, many of these societies are still very young societies. If you go outside of the rural areas, the urban areas, if you go into the rural parts of the country, these are still very traditional societies. And it's important to acknowledge that the process of modernization in many of these societies in the Middle East that have Muslim majority populations, the process of modernization has been qualitatively different than it has been in the West. And it has been qualitatively different in the following sense, that much of the change that has taken place during the 20th century, really in the post-World War II period, when these countries became independent, coming out of a particular colonial or imperial experience, that the form of modernization has been very much elite-driven and imposed on society by the state. And the state has often been controlled by ruling elites, often by the military, and there has been very little engagement, very little attempt to try and develop a democratic bargain and negotiation with civil society to bring society in to the process of political transformation, to the development of policies. It's often been these ruling elites, post-colonial elites, who come to power thinking that they know best, and they have imposed a series of policies on these societies that often haven't worked, and that often have been quite shocking for traditional societies. They've often generated a backlash, a rejection, a recoil. Just to give you one example, in 1935, the then head of state of the new country of Iran, a man by the name of Reza Pahlavi, the father of the king who was overthrown in 1979, was an authoritarian, modernizing monarch. He's sort of compared to a mini version of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in neighboring Turkey. A modernizer, a secularizer, someone who was a military man, really wanted to, I think, in his own heart of hearts, to develop and promote his own society, transform it from a traditional society to a modern one, but he decides to one day do something for Iranian women. And he literally wakes up and gives the order to his troops to go out onto the streets of Tehran, and at bayonet point to remove the veil from the head of any women or woman that they would see walking in the street. And this was done as a way of sort of rapid, the idea here was rapid modernization, but of course it was deeply shocking to a traditional society. If you read the memoirs of many of the women at that time, they did not go out of their homes during this time period, because for them it was a form of forced nakedness. They would only go out at nighttime. And those types of policies of draconian enforced secularization, modernization on a traditional society has produced a backlash. And of course it produced a backlash because many of these post-colonial societies, as we got to the end of the 20th century, were really failed societies. And they're failed societies in the political sense of that term, in the sense that they were dictatorial regimes, they were repressive. If you expressed an opinion, a dissenting point of view, you would often find yourself in jail, often tortured, forced into exile. So politically they were failed societies, and also economically they were failed societies because they were developing societies. These were societies that were experiencing many of the challenges of the developing world. Rapid urbanization, people moving into the cities, rapid sort of population growth, an inability of the government to sort of produce jobs. You had large numbers of people unemployed, very angry, and unable to express a dissenting point of view. If you express a dissenting point of view, you would find yourself in trouble. And so this has produced a series of backlashes, and one of the ways that political dissent has been expressed in these societies is in the only place where authoritarian regimes would allow a minimal amount of dissent. And that was in the traditional sectors of society, the mosque, the bazaar. All segments of secular civil society would be crushed. No independent political parties, no trade unions, no forums for intellectuals. And so you develop over time a political opposition that is very much rooted in religion. And now we see, as a result of what I would say really failed modernization policies, these political forces coming to the fore and contesting for political power. So I think that's sort of, what's happening. The other point that I want to stress here, before I turn it back to Ambassador Casey, is that it's also important to remember that we take for granted that, as I mentioned earlier, that the question of the role of religion in political society, we sort of assume that this issue has been democratically negotiated and that most modern societies have agreed on a broad sort of secular consensus where church and state needed to be separate. And of course there's different models. The French model of secularism, very different than the American model of secularism. But it's important to point out that in the case of most Muslim majority societies, these societies have never in their modern history had the opportunity to engage in a public, democratic conversation, debate, contestation over the proper role of religion in political society. How much religion do they want? How much religion do they want to set aside? What the proper balance between tradition and modernity should be. Largely because many of these societies have been ruled by authoritarian elites. We are just beginning to see the emergence in some parts of the Arab Spring. Tunisia, I think, is the more optimistic case, where you're allowing for the opening of a political space where people can begin to have these debates. Constitutional debates in these emerging democracies will be very important, because one of the big questions that is going to be debated, and it will be a very fierce debate, is what role should religion play in a new democratic constitution? What role should to what extent should the new judicial system rely on religious norms? To what extent should it be completely secular? These are deeply divisive debates that can't be resolved, in 1 week. They can't be resolved really in 1 year. These are long-term processes that emerging societies, and if you look at really any emerging democracy that has emerged from a particular authoritarian past or traditional past, whenever groups of people get together and decide to sort of write a new constitution, lay out a new blueprint for the future, one of the big questions that emerges, that's very contentious, very divisive, is the role of religion in politics. And I think the Muslim world is no different in this case. It's an open question how these debates will be resolved. I'm of the view that if given the opportunity to have a period of stability, to have a period of open debate, dialogue, discussion, contestation, back and forth, that eventually more moderate voices, more democratic voices will prevail in this process of democratic transformation. Of course, there's no guarantee that that'll take place. Democracy and elections are always a risk. But I think there really is no other way forward for these societies. I think that's, the set of policies that the international community should be trying to support and encourage, promote stability, promote open societies, allow these communities that have been have been repressed for a long period of time. Many of them are emerging from a very deeply traumatic period of political rule. Many of these ruling authoritarian regimes, unfortunately, many of them backed by the West, not all of them, but some of them, have treated their populations quite brutally. You can't expect people coming out of that experience to emerge as European liberal Democrats. I think that is a false assumption. It's going to take time. The playing field in many ways is not really balanced in favor of liberal democratic forces, but I think given an opportunity to engage in public debate, the more moderate voices will prevail, and there's examples that I could point to from Egypt and Tunisia over the last year that I think justify that claim. So with those preliminary remarks, I'll turn it back to the ambassador.
Thank you, Dr. Hashemi. I think you raised an important point at the outset, which is that in analyzing what's going on overseas and in trying to decide what to do about it as a country, that it's very important to recalibrate our expectations and to set aside our own sort of cultural prejudices and to look at things from the other person's perspective, the other country's perspective, to try to understand that. Our tradition, as you pointed out, has been the separation of church and state. And one of the reasons which you mentioned that political Islam comes to the fore overseas is because these organizations are the only ones that enjoyed any kind of political credibility, so that when you were looking for an alternative to the discredited regime, you automatically gravitated toward that. In traditional societies, family values plays an important part, and none of us, I think, are concerned about family values here. When we talk about it here in the United States, it's not religious fundamentalism, it's not even political religion, it's a sort of socio-cultural way of life. And I think a lot of folks overseas in democratizing countries, particularly in the Middle East, look at family values as sort of a natural companion to religion, and so that they turn in the direction of religiously oriented political parties.
Although there are parallels here. I think, supporters of Rick Santorum we're
Well,
very
there you
interested in
go.
family values.
There you go. There you go.
And so, you know, it's not an exact parallel, but I think in societies where people have a religious identity and they're upset at the pace of, you know, modernization, secularization, the fallback and the attachment to family values and to conservatism is sort of something that we see in all societies around the world, not just in the case of the Middle East.
Another point is that so often discredited regimes are so disconnected from the population that they govern that when a citizen is looking for a way to express an alternative opinion and to voice disapproval of the ruling elite, that they gravitate toward religious parties because of the credibility factor and have really no religious connection to them whatsoever. It's just a credible alternative. And the fact that they may be politically religious in their orientation is immaterial. So I think that then we call that the protest vote here, and I think that a number of the religious parties overseas have benefited from that as well. And then a fourth factor, which I think you would probably agree with, is it's perhaps not a scientific correlation, but that the more difficult your economic circumstances, the greater the propensity is to turn to religion as a compensatory mechanism. And so I think it was no accident that the Arab Spring occurred after a period of extended downturn in the international economy. That if you have sort of a society which is moving forward and you have hope that your economic circumstances are going to improve, at least over time, then you're not necessarily going to rock the boat. On the other hand, if you've really reached rock bottom, then you're going to go out on the street and, if necessary, tear the place down around your ears. So I think I have lots of other things that I would like to comment, but
let's
I'd
go to the
like
audience.
And solicit input, comments, and questions on that. Need a microphone here?
Sure, I'll walk right across. Sorry, everyone, I meant to keep on that side.
I would like to ask about the effect of the media on the publicizing of, you know, the political rallies and so forth. You know, if that has made a big difference in terms of the effect on the Arab Spring.
Well, I think people who are following the Arab Spring know that one of the big stories here, I think it's exaggerated, but one can't deny the salience and the importance of the role of new media. Not only the internet, Facebook, social media, but also new satellite technology that has been made, that makes the job, the traditional job of authoritarian political regimes very difficult in terms of blocking access to information and preventing the world from seeing what's taking place within their own borders. So the role of, for example, not just Al Jazeera, but of the BBC, of CNN. I remember distinctly watching the Egyptian revolution unfold, and to the credit of Anderson Cooper and his CNN staff, they were there in Tahrir Square when the regime tried to sort of silence or shut them down, and they did cut off the internet. They fled to another area. They were still able to communicate using satellite phones, and this has played, you know, a very important role. I mean, translator, just to draw a comparison, we're all following the, you know, the horrific situation in Syria today. About 30 years ago, as has been mentioned in the media commentary, there was a very famous or infamous massacre in the city of Hama, where there was an uprising. Between 10 to 20,000 people were killed by the Assad regime. No reporting of it, no satellite technology, no discussion, no really knowledge of the event until it slowly started to trickle out. And of course, critically, no YouTube, no Facebook, no attempt to get the word out of these atrocities. A very different world today, which I think has played a very important role in terms of encouraging democratic opposition forces to shine a spotlight and expose the policies and the morally reprehensive sort of posture of these authoritarian regimes that are really trying to cling to power, but thankfully it's much more difficult to hide the disgusting sort of face that they are trying to hide, but now it's really public knowledge, and I think that's played an important role in terms of these democratic revolts that we've been seeing.
One of the things that many of us have a tendency to do is to think about the Middle East as being the same, with some minor changes or minor differences. Could you speak a little bit about some of the countries and the significant differences, for example, whether it be Iran or Saudi Arabia or Jordan, to give us a sense of the nuances among them?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I mean, we often tend to think, I mean, one of the big challenges in teaching the Middle East to my students is to get them to challenge their long-standing assumptions about the region. One of the assumptions that people have is that the region, that the Middle East, that the Arab world is really a monolithic whole. There's no really difference, but there is huge differences in terms of income, in terms of language, in terms of not only linguistic dialects among people who speak Arabic, but in terms of level of modernization and education. Take, for example, I mean, I have a colleague who actually is right now teaching at the at Georgetown University in Qatar, in Doha, Qatar, which is one of the small sort of Persian Gulf states, and he and his colleagues did a study recently of the average income of a resident of Qatar, and they came up with a figure of about $75,000 a year. That includes both the actual citizens and the foreign workers. If you remove the foreign workers and you look at the average annual income of a citizen of Qatar, it rises to the level of about $475,000 a year. The average citizen. It's an oil, gas, natural gas rich state, but that's at the extreme end of the Arab world. You go to Egypt, and the popular figure is that you have a population of about 80 million. 40% of the population of Egypt lives on $2 a day. You go outside of the urban centers, very poor, very traditional, a lot of people struggling just to stay alive. A lot of people make the mistake thinking that somehow Iran is an Arab state, that people speak Arabic there. If you say that to an Iranian, he will get deeply upset at you. You also have another sort of important dynamic, an emerging dynamic in the politics of the region, and that is the role that Turkey is playing. Turkey is very much part of the Middle East, although the founders of the modern Republic of Turkey really tried to convince their population that they were Europeans and that they should be Europeans, but the refusal of the European Union to allow Turkey into its union, I think, has settled basically a question of where Turkey's future lies. And so you have another sort of important popular country, one of the big global economic powerhouses, playing an important role in the politics of the Arab Spring. That's very different than Iran, very different than the Arab world. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Cooperation Council states, very culturally, socially conservative, very different than many of the North African states that are also Arabic speaking, also Muslim majority, such as Tunisia or Morocco. So I think if one really wants to claim some knowledge, some ability to talk about the region with some sophistication, one has to resist the very easy temptation to generalize and to think that the entire region is a monolith. In the same way that we would expect, people in other parts of the world to have some appreciation for the fact that the West is not exclusively England or is not exclusively the United States. I mean, there are big differences between Norway, for example, and the state of Alabama. Both parts of the West, but very different in many ways. So I think one has to appreciate and resist the temptation to generalize.
I once had a North African say to me, "Madam, I have more in common with a Maltese than I do with somebody as far away as the Gulf." And I think that was probably, at least in that person's case, very true.
Hi.
Oh, okay.
Hi. Well, my question is for Ambassador Casey, but I'm surely interested to hear Dr. Hashemi's opinion on this. How does the U.S. feel about the Arab Spring, really? And I met somebody recently from Tunisia, and she thinks that there might be some sort of a deal between the U.S. and the Islamists taking rules in the Arab world. What do you think about that?
I always encourage people to stay away from conspiracy theories that, the United States is powerful enough and organized enough to run other people's governments around the world. I can tell you from having worked on the inside for 25 years or more that the U.S. government has to work very hard just to run its own affairs, let alone anything else around the world. As a representative of the United States, I was always very proud to represent our political values and traditions. And I think that's a hallmark of our presence overseas, especially to include our democratic traditions, the government by the people, for the people, and of the people. And from a policy perspective, the U.S. has been encouraging the democratization of government in the Middle East for decades, absolutely decades. I mean, that was a major part of my portfolio when I worked overseas. And Secretary of State Clinton was speaking in Doha just before the Arab Spring started in Tunisia. And if you go back and read that speech, she is saying, if you don't do something to democratize, your regime is going to fall. And it's just very prescient. And within, I think 10 days, the people were out on the street in Tunisia. Not because they were listening to her speech in Doha, but because they were tired of the situation in their own country. So I think that what has occurred is a cause for great satisfaction in the Middle East, while recognizing satisfaction among the U.S. government officials, while recognizing that there's a long road ahead. Some of the things that I encountered working particularly in Algeria is that it's very nice to get out on the street and sort of turn the place upside down, but then you have to get up in the morning and say, what now? What can we do to construct something positive in its place? I think it's very important to have strong political institutions. Elections are all very good, and they are the bedrock of any democratic society, but behind them are a free press, an independent judiciary, and strong counterweights within government to protect the minority from, as Thomas Jefferson eloquently phrased it, the tyranny of the majority. And I think that will be important as Arab societies continue along the path of democratization. Also, the evolution of market economies. We don't pay any attention to it because that is our economy here in the United States. But if your government is basically the business machine in country, and people go into government in order to make money, there is going to be a great disincentive to leave government. And that's when you begin getting people rearranging the constitutional furniture in order to prolong their tenure in office. So I'm a hearty believer in market economies as a good companion to the democratic process. So those are your 2 points.
Yeah, I'll take the first part of your question. Hillary Clinton, I think within the last month or so, I think characterized and really spoke to your question, where she said that there's a lot of optimism about the Arab Spring, but at the same time there's a lot of concern about the effects of destabilization. And I think that really captures, in a nutshell, what many people who are involved in U.S. foreign policy making are thinking about the Arab Spring. I think the Arab Spring came as a shock to many people. I recall distinctly the early days of the Egyptian Revolution, right in the early period when Vice President Biden was asked what he thought about Egypt and what he thought about Mubarak, and he said on PBS NewsHour that he thought that, quote, Mubarak was not a dictator. And then Hillary Clinton around the same time thought that Egypt was stable, a stable society. And of course, 18 days later, on February 11th, when Mubarak stepped down and he was overthrown, President Obama gave a very important speech celebrating the aspirations of the Egyptian people. And so in many ways, the United States, as a global power, is adjusting its policy based on unfolding events. It's important to acknowledge before an American audience that unfortunately, for a very long period of time, the United States of America has been backing and supporting the authoritarian dictatorial status quo in that region. In ways that have been actually quite embarrassing. In the year 2000, for example, the US State Department described the country of Tunisia under the dictator Ben Ali as a, quote, stable democratic country. Clearly was not, but of course that description was done because Ben Ali was our ally. Promoting democracy, I think, really has its limits. If you go back and you read President Obama's very important, very eloquent, I thought very encouraging Arab Spring speech last year, May the 19th, 2011. He tried to balance American values and American interests, American values for democracy, human rights, with American interests in the region, support for allies, support for the State of Israel. But if you read that speech, one country, of course, was completely absent, Saudi Arabia. I mean, there's no interest in really promoting democracy in Saudi Arabia for obvious reasons. You know, I think, broadly speaking, the United States is trying to both promote its values, but at the same time, it's trying to, you know, protect its interests. You know, a lot of my students were really upset at Obama in the late January of last year, early February. Why isn't Obama speaking out in favor of the protesters? Why is it taking him so long? Why the hedging? Why the sort of the reluctance? And I had to remind my students that, look, President Obama is the president of the United States of America. He is not the president of Amnesty International. And you shouldn't expect him to behave like the president of Amnesty International. Although human rights do matter, and thankfully under this administration, I think with respect to the Arab Spring, they've taken a much more important role. And I'd like to see the emphasis on human rights and democracy and basic freedoms take a much more central role, because I think that's really how you get to stable societies, societies that don't produce sort of militants. And so there's, I think, a lot of room for an important public conversation that has to take place here in the United States in terms of what type of foreign policy Americans actually want. Whether we really need to sort of rethink our long-standing support for dictatorial regimes, and whether those policies have actually come back to haunt us in many ways. And so I think the Arab Spring actually gives us an opportunity to start that conversation.
This is an inherently interesting topic because it is so ultimately messy. Religion, the idea that religion is some sort of a thing, or that even politics is some sort of thing that can be separated from the rest of life and dealt with discreetly, of course, is something most human beings have never thought about. And it's a very difficult thing, as you point out, to make a transition to where you can deal with them as abstractions. It's curious to me that, in a way, the United States, and in some ways, in a different way, Canada, have had 400 years of experience with a really analogous situation, and that is with the Native American peoples of this continent, where we've run into many of the same things, where religion and politics really don't separate very well, or religion and identity, and then you have missionaries and so on. Do you know of anyone who has attempted to recognize those parallels and to understand, if you look at the history of Native Americans, the difficulties that have been going on there seem to me very much like what's going on in tribal societies around the world.
No, it's a very good parallel. I teach a course on religion-state relations at the University of Denver, and we look at sort of different political traditions and different attempts to sort of deal with the question of the secular. And one of the issues that often comes up is how in many societies around the world, outside of the Western region of the world, when you go into large parts of Africa, Asia, Latin America, there is no clear bifurcation between, you know, where the borders of religion begin, where they end, and where politics. They're deeply integrated. And I think that has been really the norm historically for many traditional societies, including Native American societies. You know, the idea of the secular, that there is some realm that we can demarcate, that sort of where the secular begins and where religion ends, is very much a modern Western notion that we often use and we take for granted because it's been so central to our political experience. But when you go to many traditional societies, you go to India, for example, you go to, you know, traditional societies in large parts of the developing world, that demarcation is simply not there. They've had a different experience, a different sort of worldview. And so no, very few people have really drawn upon the Native American comparison. Much of what gets discussed is really the case of India, the case of, you know, of East Asian societies, of African societies, of Islamic societies. But I think the native case, an example, really falls into that same paradigm. It's not often discussed in the academic literature, unfortunately, because sadly, a lot of people really don't care about what's happening with native communities because they're considered part of the past. The bigger challenges are what's happening in the Muslim world, in China, and in other parts of the world. Those are the ones that sort of affect our economy and get all the attention in the academic literature and in our public conversation.
My question is to Dr. Hashemi. I found the recent sentencing of President Mubarak to life in prison to be kind of a salutary event and hopefully indicative of growing political institutions within Egypt. Will this event have reverberations throughout the Mideast, and how do you view the fact that this form of justice was implemented in Egypt's case?
No, it's a very good question. You know, if you're not following the story, last week President Mubarak was on trial and a sentence was issued that he was to be sentenced to life imprisonment. And when that was announced, there was a lot of celebration and joy. But then when the judgment came down for the other people who were on trial, particularly his sons, and then many of the ministers and sort of top echelon sort of actors in the Egyptian regime who were all exonerated or not charged, there was an explosive reaction. So the view in Egypt is that, you know, it's not simply good enough or satisfactory enough for societies that have been long oppressed by dictatorial regimes to simply take one figurehead, condemn him to life imprisonment, and thinking that that is going to solve the problem. Because the problem in Egypt, as it is in Syria, as it is in many of these societies that we're talking about, is not simply one individual, but it's a structure of power that extends deep into society, and where there is a ruling elite of many political leaders who are complicit in the chaos that these societies have been experiencing for the last 3 to 4 decades. And so what really people, I think, are wanting in Egypt is really a complete cleansing of the judicial system. People want an honest judicial system where if someone comes to court, if there's a trial, there's a fair judicial process, that people will actually, you know, be given a sentence that really merits the crimes that were committed. That really hasn't taken place. In the case of Egypt, what's happening is the ruling military council has basically thrown Mubarak under the bus, hoping that they can preserve their own political power and hoping to sort of assuage the sort of sentiments of the Egyptian population, and then it'll be business as usual. But I think beyond that, one can say that the fact that you have a military, you have a head of state, someone who's like Mubarak, who a year and a half ago, the idea that he could even be brought to a court and forced to answer and be convicted would be completely inconceivable. I think that is a very hopeful and optimistic sort of development that I think people would like to see more of. And I think it sends a message also to other dictatorial rulers that if they don't compromise, share power, that their fate will be similar to Mubarak's. But it's important to realize that there's a much deeper problem here. It's not simply bringing Mubarak to trial and then exonerating all the other people who have blood on their hands. It's really a comprehensive transformation of an authoritarian political system toward a democratic one, where you have really an independent judiciary that can issue judgments and that can sort of start to address many of the long-standing grievances that these societies have been facing.
After the First World War, Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire, was on the wrong side of the war. Right. And the French and the British divided up what had been the Ottoman Empire into a number of arbitrary countries, drawing lines through religious groups, meshing religious groups that didn't belong together, totally irrespective of tribal groups. What impact is that having today on the situation?
Yeah, no, very good question. As you correctly state, you know, many of the states that we now know as being sort of important states in the region, if you look at a map of the Middle East prior to World War I, there's no evidence that they existed. Iraq, Kuwait, many of the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, even modern Turkey. And when the borders were drawn up, as you correctly indicate, they were drawn up in Paris and London without any concern or input as to what the actual people in the region wanted. In the Arab world, the dominant sentiment that emerges is there was a desire for a pan-Arab state where all people who spoke Arabic, particularly in the Levant area, would form one collective union. That didn't happen. But there's been huge consequences because of this carve-up. And of course, one of the big consequences that often gets forgotten, but you're all familiar with it, is really the tragic case of the Kurds. The Kurds are a distinct ethnic group in the region, and unfortunately, when the colonial carve-up took place, there was no value for any independent Kurdistan, and they found themselves really divided between 4 countries: Iran, Turkey, Iraq, and a little bit in Syria. And so the idea of any independent Kurdish state emerging is inherently difficult, because in order for that to happen, you have to deal with 4 different countries, none of whom want to grant not only independence, they don't want to grant autonomy, let alone independence, right? So there has been these negative consequences where you have communities that have been formed, states that have been formed that were ethnically very different. The most, I think, salient example is the case of Iraq. Iraq was really put together by the British from some of the most ethnically and religiously diverse parts of the former Ottoman Empire. The Kurds, the Shi'is, the Sunnis in the center, very different. They were forged into one country. And these cleavages have now reemerged during times of political instability, chaos, and turmoil, as we saw in the aftermath of the American occupation. As the state, the central state, starts to break down, people fall back on more traditional loyalties. The Kurds going their own way, the Shi'i Muslims, the majority in Iraq, identifying with their own political parties as a way of addressing their grievances, the Sunnis the same. But it's important to also point out, though, that despite the colonial carve-up, a lot of time has passed. Several generations of people have been born, bred, and raised in these societies. And except for the extreme element of the political spectrum in the region, and I'm talking about Al-Qaeda, except for that small political constituency, no one in the modern Middle East wants to redraw the borders of the region. Iraqis, Iraq is the one question mark, but most people have been born and bred with a particular sort of commitment, and their identity is deeply ensconced in their own national identity. And that's why if you look at the demonstrations in the Arab Spring, one of the things that you actually see in all of these demonstrations is the national flag of the country being flown. In Tunisia, in Egypt, in Syria, there's no desire to redraw the borders. And that just, I think, speaks to one of those important lessons of history, that it's very difficult to roll back the clock. However, we might want to imagine it, if we could do it all over again, perhaps giving these societies a better chance at stability and democracy. The borders are intact, and most of the populations in these societies, with the exception of the Kurds, want to keep those borders. And there's no desire to redraw them. And so I think we're stuck with the borders that we have, for better or for worse.
My study of the Middle East has led me to 2 hypotheses I'd like you to comment on, if you would, please. One is that during the Cold War, the puppet governments that were set up or supported were largely secular, and many of them became corrupt and are famous for their corruption, which hurt the people a great deal, and that they concentrated wealth within the oligarchy, did not distribute it to the poor. The second hypothesis I'd like to ask you to comment on is in religion. My understanding of the Muslim religion is that it is very much against corruption and very much in favor of distribution of what is produced by society to the whole society. Mm-hmm. I don't want to go into that anymore, but would you confirm those, or would you comment on those?
Yeah, I think you're basically right. What I would like to amplify and comment on is, yes, as we've seen in the Arab Spring, one of the reasons why there's a lot of political frustration and desires for political change is because all of these post-colonial regimes, over the period of several decades, have proven themselves to be monumentally corrupt. The case of actually Tunisia is really the extreme case, where the level of nepotism and cronyism of the ruling family was just so extreme that they had a very small basis of support within the country when the moment of crisis emerged. The same in Egypt, and of course a lot of people ask, well, look, Egypt was the second largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid. Where's all the money gone? Why the extreme? So if you traveled, and I assume some people in this audience have traveled to parts of the region, if you travel to some of these cities, if you go outside of the urban areas, or even you travel within the urban areas, you see huge disparities in wealth within one city. And this is one of the core frustrations that people have. With respect to the question of Islam, I'm very reluctant to say that sort of the Islamic religion believes X. All religions are comprised of a multiplicity of different interpretations. Some of them, I think, more progressive, some of them more regressive. In the case of Islam, one interpretation that is very popular and prominent is the idea that it is morally incumbent upon believers to distribute their wealth. And in fact, one of the key pillars of Islam is that you are obligated on an annual basis to give a particular donation to charity. It's known as zakat, generally assumed to be 2.5% of your annual income, to charity. And so the idea of almsgiving, the idea of distributing the wealth is considered to be part of your moral obligation as a believer. But of course, ruling regimes and countries that have a lot of wealth, like the Saudis, like the Qataris, they had a lot of wealth, and they say, look, yes, you know, we have a lot of wealth, but we give a lot of money in charity. We give a lot of donations to different societies. There's nothing wrong with us and our particular rule in and of itself. If you want to judge us based on the charity and the money that we distribute throughout the Muslim world, we've got a pretty good track record. So, you know, it's important to be, you know, a little bit careful when we speak about, or when we say, you know, the Islamic religion believes X. There are some basic principles. I think charity is one of them. But, you know, you have a lot of people who can manipulate, who can distort, reinterpret religion in almost any way you want. I think that's a truism of all religions. One final thing. One of the core grievances that people have, and one of the reasons why religious-based political parties are so popular, is because one of the things that they do in their political program is they have a strong economic critique of the ruling political status quo. They're deeply upset that you have ruling elites that are very affluent, prosperous, and you have large segments of the population that are not. And they bring that up constantly. And they say that, well, if we come into political power, we will start to redistribute and engage in the type of economic activity that will benefit the majority of society. And they do that by drawing upon a certain particular religious interpretation, saying that we are obligated to do this as believers.
We have one last question, and then I'll ask Ambassador Casey and Dr. Hashemi to make closing comments.
Yeah. Who's our final?
A lot of these places you mentioned seem to be fast declining their freshwater supplies and energy supplies with heavy populations. And I just wonder if the weight of that imbalance may be too much for any political or economic system to survive finally.
No, it's a very good question. It's often gets ignored in the debates that we have about the Middle East because there's an assumption that the place is rich in oil and natural resources, particularly petroleum resources, and there's an assumption that those resources will be there forever. And so eventually they are going to run out. The problem is that because over the last 30, 40 years, there's been so much wealth that's been generated that many of the ruling elites that are responsible for, you know, developing those natural resources, particularly petroleum, are so drunk on their own sense of self-righteousness, their own sense of invulnerability, that they believe that, you know, the oil will always be there and they can continue. I'm talking particularly about Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Cooperation Council states. There's no sense of looking past, because if you look at at least the predictions for the next 50 years, it does seem like those resources are going to be around. But eventually, it's going to come to an end. And I don't think there's been a lot of really serious thinking about what to do when that day comes. The other more salient issue is the question of water. This is a very dry part of the world, very hot part of the world in terms of the climate. Some countries, the question of water is very salient and very important, such as Yemen, where there is a huge problem. You also have, you know, despite the failures of modernization, one of the things that these post-colonial states did do that can be credited is that they were able to provide basic health care to their populations. But one of the consequences of that is you have population explosions taking place. There's just not enough natural resources, water to go around, given that imbalance. And so these are some of the important sort of economic challenges, that environmental challenges that will eventually lead to and exacerbate the political conflict that exists there. I think the only way of really dealing with it is, and why I'm so supportive of democratic transitions, is the only way of responsibly dealing with these issues is through a democratic political system where people can actually hold their political leaders to account, can raise these issues without fear of political retribution, and can say, look, we have to think about the long term of our societies, not just the short term.
Closing comments from you.
Go ahead.
Our discussion this evening has raised a number of the complex aspects that democratizing societies face in the Middle East. And as we walk out of this room and as our viewers elsewhere around the country leave their venues, I would ask you all to lend your support to what the U.S. government is trying to do overseas with these democratizers to help them consolidate the gains that they initiated, that they achieved on the street last year. It's a long road ahead. There's a lot of education, there's a lot of ups and downs. But we have some experience, some track record in this, and I think we have a role to play. And we depend on your support for the budgetary process that provides funds that brings those programs to fruition. So put your money where your mouth is.
I'd just like to end by really quoting from someone who you're all familiar with, your own president, Barack Obama. As I mentioned earlier, last May the 19th, 2011, he gave a very important speech on the Arab Spring that's worth tracking down. Go home, Google it, and read it. And I just want to read the last section of that speech because I think really it speaks to the fundamental sort of concerns that many Americans have about the future of the Arab Spring. But he also, in this speech, really was able to, I think, interpret and orient and present the question, the anxieties, the concerns, and also the optimism that many people have toward the political changes in the region within the context of American history. And so the last paragraph of that speech, 2 paragraphs I want to read to you because I think it really captures in ways that are very articulate, very, I think, nuanced and much better than I can articulate. And it really, I think, encapsulates quite nicely what we're facing today in the Middle East. He said, President Obama, last May, quote, "For the American people, the scenes of upheaval in the region may be unsettling, but the forces driving it are not unfamiliar. Our own nation was founded through a rebellion against an empire. Our people fought a painful civil war that extended freedom and dignity to those who were enslaved. And I would not be standing here today unless past generations turned to the moral force of nonviolence as a way to perfect our own union, organizing, marching, protesting peacefully together to make real those words that declared our nation, quote, 'We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.' Those words must guide our response to the changes that are transforming the Middle East and North Africa today. Words that tell us that repression will fail, that tyrants will fall, and that every man and woman is endowed with certain inalienable rights. It will not be easy. There's no straight line to progress, and hardship always accompanies a season of hope. But the United States of America was founded on the belief that people should govern themselves. And now we cannot hesitate to stand squarely on the side of those who are reaching for their rights, knowing that their success will bring about a world that is more peaceful, more stable, and more just. Thank you.
A huge thank you to Ambassador Casey and Dr. Hashemi for their participation tonight, and many, many kudos to those of you who asked great probing questions. I think our thinking has been greatly broadened by our participation tonight. Thanks to all of you who have watched us from afar. We hope you've had the experience that we have and have found this to be a worthwhile experiment. I will bid you good night, and we hope to see you from Denver again soon. So, for the rest of us,